We knew that Vivian had spoken to her friends and had plans to travel with Richard over the Christmas period. So what we tried to find was, where are her tickets, where is her money gone? They've been working and she's been making lots of money according to her friends. There's got to be money, there's got to be tickets somewhere.
We found the travel agent up at King's Cross, where both Vivian and Richard had booked tickets for this overseas trip. Interestingly enough, Richard, on the 27th of December, had arranged for these tickets to be cancelled and for the money to be sent to his parents' place. That struck her as odd, at the witness at the travel agent, because of the fact they'd paid for them separately and because there'd been this insistence on paying for them separately.
The 27th of December appeared to be a busy day for Richard. On that day, the first business day after Christmas, and the time police believed Vivian was murdered, Richard had visited his bank.
We were aware from our inquiries that Vivian had a shoebox that she collected her money in. She had a distrust of banks, as I understand it. And interestingly enough, Richard had banked a significant amount of money on the 27th of December, which we can't account for as to where he obtained that money. So I've got this name, Richard White. The first thing to do is to get on the computer to check to see if he's got a criminal history. Now that's unlikely, or at least at that stage I assumed it was unlikely, because we'd run this fingerprint through the system.
If Richard White did have a record, then his fingerprints should have popped up when the fingerprint found on the newspaper was fed into the police database.
But the record comes back showing that he's got a history of an assault and a drink driving matter. So I ring our fingerprint expert and we give him the name. And like I said, at this stage, I'm a little bit curious as to why it hasn't come up if we've done the fingerprint checks before. I remember he said, look, leave it with me. And he went off to do the search, rang back and said, look, I've got some bad news, it's not him.
What we couldn't understand is that we finally identified the girl, and hopefully it would all fall into place with the killer as well, with that fingerprint being on the newspaper. To be told that it wasn't a match was just like, how could it not be?
Cole said, look, there's something about this print that's not right. It looks like it should fit. You know, there are patterns in it that look like they actually are similar to what this fellow has as a fingerprint on record. So I said, look, leave it with me, I'll talk to somebody.
A gut instinct told detectives that Richard White was their man. So while the fingerprint section continued their examination of his prints, nothing was released to the public about Jane Doe's identity.
Well, we wanted to keep her identity out of the media at this stage simply because we didn't know where Richard White was. And there was a strong possibility that he could escape the net by going overseas to a country without extradition process for us. So we were very conscious of that, and we were also aware that they had planned a trip overseas, so he had the means to do that if he had not already travelled overseas. There was also the thinking that, look, if he had a co-offender and he had evidence still here that might convict him, it would be relatively easy to destroy it before we could actually get to it. So the notion was to identify his whereabouts and identify all the likely areas where there was evidence before actually making this public.
From the lease of Vivian's unit, we had Richard's full name and an address for him that we'd worked out from our inquiries that was his parents' home. What we needed to do was to speak to the parents, but you can't go out to someone and say, excuse me, is your son involved in a horrific murder? Michael thought the idea of just sending out one of the local traffic police to inquire if Richard was around in relation to a traffic incident. Just keeping it nice and innocent, that way you're not going to alert Richard if he does need to be spoken to by us.
Officer, yes, Mrs. White, is it?
The traffic sergeant did a really good job in establishing that Richard had in fact left the country on the 2nd of January and had flown to Bangkok. Probably the other significant thing that the traffic sergeant was able to tell us is that the family actually had a German Shepherd. So we had a couple of pieces of evidence there that we could see starting to fall into place.
Beautiful dog.
From the inquiries that the local police officer did for us going to the parents' house, we found out that Richard had a vehicle or a van that he'd sold. So then we knew a van that we then had to track down to see when he'd sold it, was it used around Christmas, and is it of any purpose to our investigation.
We were extremely lucky in that the new owner had never washed the van and had not cleaned out what was an old carpet that he'd kept in the back. It had a stain on it, but it had been treated in some fashion with chemicals, thinners or some other item from Richard's French polishing trade. It looked very deliberate, that he disguised this spill by pouring a chemical over it.
It indicated that something had been trying to be covered up. It's like whitewashing graffiti off a wall.
The crime scene investigator observed that on the underside of the mat there were some areas where there was underfelt. And in one of those areas he saw a dark stain which appeared to be blood. He also examined the gearbox cover in the vehicle and observed dark brown staining to that area. He carried out a presumptive test for blood on that stain, which gave a very quick positive reaction.
So we were pretty confident we'd found the vehicle that had actually transported that body. I might add too that the van and the carpet still had trace hairs from a German Shepherd.
But there was still the question of the fingerprint. In most homicides, the victim knows their killer. When Jane Doe was identified as Vivian Ruiz, the obvious suspect was her sparring partner and boyfriend, Richard White. It was a surprise then that his fingerprints didn't match those on the newspaper stuffed down her throat.
Brought it to me and we checked it together and I said, pictorially, it's a perfect J-loop, absolute match. Go back and reverse it.
What Barry Fay was asking for was a negative image to be made of Richard White's fingerprint. And when it was done, it perfectly fitted the fingerprint found on the newspaper.
We call it a tonal reverse. It's not the ridges that we're looking at here, we're looking at the valleys. So the fingerprint black lines were in fact the grooves between each papillary ridge. And when we first saw those three blood-like fingerprints on the newspaper, we theorised that the killer has blood all over his hands. He finds the newspaper nearby and grabs at it. The grabbing action takes all the blood off the tops of the ridges, but the valleys in between are still damp. And then he starts pushing it down the throat. He makes that last desperate thrust with those three fingers to get it as far down the throat as he can. The valleys of the fingerprint come forward now under pressure and transfer the fingerprint pattern. Then as he pulls his hand out, the paper closes around it, and he may have then finished the wad off with two hands to make sure.
It was a 1 in a million forensic phenomenon, and a call went straight through to the hard-working detectives.
It was pretty good because we'd done so much work, and to finally get a match of who she was, then the boyfriend, and then to say there's a fingerprint and it's a match, it was just fantastic. It was the best thing we've had in months. So we could then go on to our next stages of finding him. From the inquiries with the immigration department, we knew that Richard had left the country and gone via Bangkok under his own name and passport.
And White had actually booked his tickets to travel overseas on the 31st of December, which was the first business date that he could have booked the tickets after the body was located. At that point, we'd been able to establish that Richard had travelled via the Philippines and had gone to England, but where, we weren't sure.
We received a fax from the Australian High Commission in London asking for assistance to trace a Richard White who was suspected of murdering a female called Vivian Ruiz in Sydney in December 1991.
And how long are you going to be away for?
We managed to do a check on the phone records of the White family in Bexley. There were a number of reverse charges phone calls to England, and we provided the Metropolitan Police with those phone numbers, most of which came to phone boxes in the southwest of England, but there was a phone number there for Newcastle, and we established this was actually an uncle's address.
We just couldn't knock on the door. So we then made a few inquiries around bars. We found that White used to like to go to clubs and bars, so we went round and made a few inquiries there. And I actually showed a photograph of White to a barmaid, and she says, he's Australian, isn't he? And then I was sure he was definitely there. So I came up with the idea that we'd put a phone call into White's aunts and uncles. And I got this rather husky-voiced lady detective to ring up and ask, is Richard there? And said, yeah, I'm Richard. So immediately we're in through the door, and he's standing near the fireplace with a phone in his hand.